Hey everybody, welcome back to another video. So today I want to talk about the Portable Jack Kerouac. So what this book basically is, it's a collection of excerpts from all of Jack Kerouac's major works that's put together into one long narrative, and it was edited by Ann Charters. And throughout Jack Kerouac's writing, throughout all of his books, he's always referred to his collection of works as the Douloise legend, and he planned to at some point in his life put together into one long narrative like this, but he died before that was ever done. So this was kind of a way to finally, put Jack Kerouac's vision into reality by putting all of his major works together, pulling the important pieces of his major works together and putting together into one narrative here. Because with my interest in Jack Kerouac, I've really only enjoyed reading his road novels, his travel novels, just his life story from on the road until his death. I never had much of an interest in reading about his childhood, but I figured that if I really want to understand Jack Kerouac, I need to really understand his childhood. So I was really excited to read, bits and pieces of his works that focus on his childhood. And I'm still not very interested in his childhood. It doesn't really do a lot to me when I read it. I don't really care too much about reading about his childhood in the 1920s. I mean, it's interesting just to understand it, but I'm not going to go out and buy all the books, all the novels he wrote about his childhood. It doesn't interest me that much. I'm just interested in really just understanding it, for the sake of understanding his later books. But I will say that reading about his childhood, the way that he writes about it, I really see that he, in his head, really lived in his childhood. All the wandering that he did later in life, on the road, and the novels after that, you really get a sense of why he was wandering. He just never really moved on, I don't think, mentally from his brother dying when he was a child. And you can see he was really haunted by that. Just the way he writes about his childhood, you really see that mentally he was still there. And another interesting thing, he writes a lot about his Catholic past. He definitely, when he was a child, looked at the world through the lens of being Catholic. And you can see how, when he talks about being Catholic, you can tell that he was really searching for God in his life. And it really makes you look at On the Road a little differently, the way that he was just wandering. You see he was actually searching for some kind of, I feel like he was looking for some kind of religious experience in his traveling. He doesn't really talk about religion a lot in On the Road, but reading about in his childhood, him talking about, religion, reflecting on that, you really see how in a way that kind of continues into On the Road, even though it's a little more subliminal, I think, in On the Road itself. And another interesting thing that I liked reading about in this, the excerpts of his time in the Merchant Marines was really interesting, just hearing about that, because you don't really hear about that very much in his later works. So it was interesting to read about that. You can kind of see how that really shaped him, quite a bit during his younger years. And seeing the way that he writes about his brother when he reflects on his childhood, the way he talks about, what he felt when his brother died, you really see that in his other works, focusing on his 20s. The way that he describes Neal Cassady or Dean Moriarty in On the Road is very similar. You can see that he really, I think, saw his brother in Neal Cassady. So I feel like Jack Kerouac was kind of always searching for his brother, searching for someone who could kind of replace his brother spiritually. And I feel like Neal Cassady was that person for Jack Kerouac. So you can see why he really latched on to Neal Cassady, really found interested in him, because he just reminded him of his brother. And being able to read a bunch of his writings together in one narrative really allowed me to reflect on his writing style a little better this time, reading through this book. And I feel that his writing style is kind of written as a confession. Just reading about him talking about his Catholic past, you really see that he's trying to really confess his soul to the reader. And seeing that in his childhood, his writing about his childhood, it really makes you look at the rest of his writing very differently. And you kind of see it as this confession. He's trying to really just pour his soul out, for people to read. But more than anything else, I think that reading about his childhood really makes you see that the Beat generation itself was really rooted in the 20s and the 30s. Like, that's where they grew up. This hard time that they grew up in the 20s and 30s really shaped the way they looked at the world. So I think in that sense, reading about his childhood is really the best way to understand, who Jack Kerouac is as a person. And you also notice in his writing that jazz music and bop music is really, just an underlying theme in everything he writes about. From the way he writes to the way he describes the world, music is a key part in Jack Kerouac's writing. I think if you look at all the jazz and bop artists, that were popular when Jack Kerouac was traveling in the 1950s, they lived very similar lifestyles. They grew up in a very similar environment as Jack Kerouac. They really grew up in the 20s and 30s. So I feel like the way that jazz and bop music is like pure, American music, Jack Kerouac's writing, the Beat Generation writing, is also just pure American writing, which was just created by the environment that these artists and these writers lived in. And not only does this book include excerpts from all of his major novels, it also includes some odds and ends, some letters, different articles he wrote, reflections on Buddhism, all kinds of things that he wrote throughout his career. And my favorite part of that was actually his reflections on the Beat Generation itself, because I feel like with all his other novels, you're reading about his life, but it's in a sense it's fiction. It's based off of his life. But when you're reading about his reflection on the Beat Generation, you're really reading about him, and it's about him, and it's his reflections on his life, not written through the lens of a semi-autobiographical novel. And the way he describes the Beat Generation is basically, he kind of describes it as just, a collection of curious people, just, people who are very interested in the world, very interested in learning new things. And if you look at all the traveling Jack Kerouac did, that was made possible by the country really opening up during that time. The interstate system, people could really travel all over the country. And curious people are going to be the first people really to start doing that for fun. I think Jack Kerouac really represents the first group of people who really went out to travel for the sake of traveling, just to explore and just to understand other parts of the country. People definitely did that before Jack Kerouac, but the way that he did it was just a very modern and fresh and a new way of looking at America. Because throughout Jack Kerouac's writings, he describes the slums, the skid rows of New York and San Francisco, but he also describes, the desolation of wide open highways. He really just describes every aspect of America that people really hadn't really explored, in the way that he explored it through his writing at this time. And the same way that he describes himself in the Beat Generation of being a group of very curious people, you also see that he was very cynical. He's very unhappy, I think, about the world, and that really comes through in his writing as well. And especially, looking at his reflections on the Beat Generation, reflections on becoming this celebrity. He wasn't very happy about that, and I feel like as you go further and deeper into his writings, you really see that come out a lot more, that he just really wasn't a truly happy person deep down inside. I think it really raised the question of, if he really didn't like being famous, if he really didn't like, being the figurehead of this major generation, why did he keep publishing novels? Obviously, he had something he wanted to accomplish with his writing. So, it just raises the question, if he was so upset about being famous, why did he continue to pursue being famous? But I feel like he was always going to be that way. With the Beat Generation, there was this disillusionment with society, with America. And it was someone who thinks like that is never going to like being famous. So I feel like he was always going to look at fame that way. And that's just the way that he is. It's just the way that generation was. And in his reflections on the Beat Generation and counterculture in general, he describes himself as being not someone on the left, not someone on the right, just a very centrist, kind of, moderate, middle-of-the-road person. So it's interesting to hear him say that when, the Beat Generation really fueled the 1960s. But I feel like that's the kind of person that was going to do that. He really wasn't political in his writing. He was very just interested in describing America, describing people. And that openness is really what I think drove the counterculture of the 1960s. But reading about his reflections on the Beat Generation and counterculture, he reminds me a lot of someone like Bob Dylan or someone like Kurt Cobain, who really wanted to be this super successful artist, but at the same time really despised being famous. But someone who writes about discontent for society, discontent for the state of America, is going to be someone who's not going to like being famous. So I feel like it just kind of goes with someone like this. Like they want to be famous, but at the same time they want to complain about being famous. It's just the way people like this are. And he talks a bit about the meaning of the Beat Generation. What does the term beat mean? I feel like the Beat Generation, that term takes on a lot of meanings. I think the most what most people think of it is like they were just beat. You know, they went through, you know, the Great Depression, they went through World War II, and they're just beat. You know, and it also takes on the meaning of the beat of the music, you know, the beat of your own drummer. But what Jack Kerouac describes beat as, it comes from the Catholic term beatitude, meaning ultimate bliss. So once again, you see this very Catholic, you know, undertone to his writings, where, you know, he was really, I think in his life, looked at himself as a Catholic. He saw himself as a Catholic, and he was really searching for some kind of religious experience, you know, in his traveling. So that kind of fits with his life, you know, the beat generation, meaning beat, like the word beatitude. But at the same sense, I think that's the opposite of the term everyone thinks of the beat generation. I think it's like as just beat, worn down, but it's really the opposite of that. It's about finding bliss, finding happiness, finding good experiences in life. But on top of that, another major theme in his writing is Buddhism. And with Buddhism, he liked this idea of life being suffering. So I think he was trying to, you know, use suffering to find meaning in life, which I think that also kind of contradicts, you know, using the word beatitude as well. So it's kind of hard to say what the term beat actually means. But regardless of all that, I feel like the way that Jack Kerouac found meaning in life was through his writing. He really enjoyed writing. I think, you know, just pouring his soul on paper was the way that he found inner peace. And even though his writing is about his life itself, I think writing about your life really allows you to find the connections you want to find, kind of create the endings that you want to create, and kind of just look at your life through, you know, the lens that you want to look at it through. Because on a macro scale, I feel like Jack Kerouac's work is biography. It's truth. It's what really happened. But on a micro scale, it's fiction. At the end of the day, it's fiction. He changes quite a bit of, you know, things that happen throughout his life in his writing, you know, on a very small scale. He looks at his life the way that he wants to look at it as. And that's what he's writing. He's writing about the parts of his life that he wants to write about. But I think what really draws me to Jack Kerouac's writing is his descriptions of America. He really describes America in a way that I think no one else really has since him. He just really describes America as this place of movement, this place of discovery, this place you can just go out and explore. And I think he also describes the state of post-World War II America, the state of the 1950s, the state of, you know, America before this whole counterculture, you know, revolution began. And I think that he really does that better than any other writer has throughout American history. But I feel like at that point in American history, America was really primed for this counterculture revolution to begin. You know, in this era of conformity, there was going to be some counterculture revolution that was going to take place. And someone was going to be the figurehead of the early years of that counterculture. It just happened to be Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac just happened to be the person who wrote about it and who happened to be the one who people remember. And that's why I feel like his writing is still very relevant today. But anyway, that's the Portable Jack Kerouac, edited by Ann Charters. And yeah, it's a very interesting read. I think what it is geared for is someone who, you know, read a couple of Jack Kerouac novels, never really, you know, read his works in entirety. So that's kind of what it was for me. You know, I read quite a few Jack Kerouac novels, so all of his road novels, but I hadn't really read much about his childhood, so it was interesting to read this to get a sense of his childhood and see that in context with the rest of his books. But that's what I feel like this is for. It's for someone who's, you know, read a couple of Jack Kerouac books, wants to know a little more about his life, and that's what I think this is good for. So yeah, that's that. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next book review.